Christians hate science. I mean, they've always hated science, right? For hundreds of years, they've tried to suppress it and squash it, and the Pope has always been trying to drive a dagger into the soul of truth. Well, no, not really. The truth is, and without trying to go into too much of a history lesson, it's always been kind of back and forth. Actually, a lot of great scientific discoveries have happened because of the church. And yes, there's been a great deal of friction over the years back and forth, but let's talk about today. Let's talk about modern Christians and how they approach science. And I'm only going to talk about those friends of mine that are very fundamentalist. Obviously, there's some Christians that are extremely liberal and they take things in a very different way. But let's just talk about my fundamentalist Christian friends who are, Bible thumpers, if you want to put it that way. I can't think of a single one of them that isn't absolutely fascinated with the latest discoveries in biology and in physics and quantum theory and gravitational waves and don't get excited every time there's another great discovery in science. Where there does tend to be friction these days is over things that for whatever reason certain Christians have a problem with. And the tendency to overgeneralize both science and Christians is really kind of absurd. First of all, science is a huge concept, and there's a lot of different things in science. There's so many different sciences now that someone could go to school for probably 100 years and not be able to understand every aspect of science. But looking at Christians and saying that simply because they have a problem with this facet or the other is kind of an absurdity. And mostly I want to go over what I think the reasons are for that. After all, when you tell a Christian that we've discovered something recent about gravity, about atoms, about how the human body works, all sorts of different facets, they say, well, that's fascinating. I would love for my microwave oven to work better. I would love for us to be able to travel to the stars. I'm fascinated by this aspect and that aspect. But they'll get hung up on things like the age of the earth. Now, why is that? Well, when you really think about it, both science and religion are both just myths. And I'm not trying to diss either one of them when I say that. But the simple fact of the matter is that we don't know. We weren't around 4.5 million years ago, or billion years ago. We weren't there for the creation of the earth. We weren't there for the creation of the universe. We have no idea. Scientifically, we read the evidence as best we can, and we come up with a hypothesis, and then we find things to support that hypothesis. And that's science. Religion has people who have stated certain things. Now, obviously, different Christians take those things in different ways. Some take many of the things stated in the Bible, just like a lot of religions take things stated in their own religious texts as being metaphors, or as being partial metaphors. But the point is that when someone says, okay, how did the world begin? How did it begin? How did it start? You can either go with what science says, which is just sort of, well, this is the way we read the evidence, this is how we read what we see, or we can go with our belief system, which appears to have said certain things. And obviously for some people that's the way they go. And why wouldn't they? It's very easy to believe a large majority of science without believing every single thing science says. And I don't think any of us do. I love science. I'm fascinated by all aspects of science, but I don't believe everything they say. There's all kinds of aspects that I question, regardless of how fascinated in it I am. And I think that's simply the way it is for Christians. Now, when they deny something for whatever reason, because they believe the world is only 6 point something thousand years old, um, then people accuse them of questioning gravity. And they don't question gravity, for heaven's sakes. Yes, I'm sure you can find a few Christians who believe some pretty whacked out things, but most Christians I've ever met are pretty even thinking, and they believe in all of those things, or many of those things. But it's when it really comes down to it, every single one of us takes what we believe and what we don't believe. We take certain things and say, okay, that makes sense to me, and this doesn't make sense to me. And if for someone, God creating the world a certain amount of time ago makes more sense to them, that's what they believe. Now, they may not feel that they completely understand it, and maybe the 6,000 years is really pretty arbitrary. But the bottom line is that that's what they were brought up with. And for them, denying that is to deny a part of their faith, and it makes more sense to them. So that's what they go with. And in general, when science comes to them with something, and they say this is true and this is true, they go, oh, well, that's great. But for instance, I remember a particular news story where Bill Nye came before a group of people in, I think it was one of the southern states, and he said something about the moon. And I think that if he had simply said something about the moon and how old the moon was and certain things about it, he would have been fine. But he felt a need to not only state what he stated about the moon, but state it in counterpoint to what the Bible said. And it's the worst thing you can possibly do, because perfectly even logical thinking Christians, for whom you come to them and say, oh, your Bible is a lie, well, they're suddenly going to take offense to it, and they're suddenly going to appear much less logical than they probably would in a normal conversation. And this is a problem I've always had with people like Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson, both of whom I respect greatly as scientists and as personalities who bring science to people, but then for no reason, in my opinion, feel a need to somehow counterpoint that to religion. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson will often say mysticism. He doesn't want to say religion. He doesn't want to say Christianity. I don't know. Perhaps he has an aunt or an uncle who's very religious. But for some reason, he doesn't quite want to say that. He always pawns it off as if he's talking about some sort of occultism. But he's not. He's talking about Christianity, and you can tell by what he talks about. And he feels a need to say, this isn't right, this is now right. And anytime you do that, anytime you come across to a believer in anything as if you're coming up against them, they're going to have a reaction. Even if normally in a perfectly logical conversation over dinner, they might say, well, sure, we don't know. Yes, that's what the Bible said, but we have no earthly idea what it really meant. Obviously in Genesis, the fact that the sun wasn't even created on the first day. How was it the first day? How can you have a day without the sun? There's a certain amount of logical problems there, which to people like myself say, okay, maybe this was a metaphor to some extent. But regardless of those things, when you come to a person and say, your religion is wrong, your God is wrong, that's the reaction you're going to get. And I think that personalities like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye would get a lot further if they'd simply state what they stated. There's no need to bring religion into it. If for no other reason than because some religious people are just going to take that and say, okay, well, that's interesting. It doesn't need to be a fight. You don't need to specifically try to speak to those specific people who you think are stupid, especially because all you do is take people who probably aren't stupid and perhaps make them sound stupid in the way that you come across to them. And for all any of that matters, it's not as if you have to believe everything in science to either get along in the world or be a scientist for all that matters. Yes, there's certain aspects of science. Uh, let's say that your job had to do with the age of the world. You might need to believe those things in order to be in that part of science. To be in biology, to be in certain parts of physics, to be in medicine. Um, Obviously, Ben Carson, for instance, is an excellent example of of a neurosurgeon who, as far as we know, seems to believe very strongly in the very literal Bible. Um, those things are not necessary, and it gets very irritating sometimes when scientists will come up with these broad statements and say, "We are teaching lies in our schools if we don't teach children about evolution and this is that and the other." And I'm not saying those things shouldn't be taught, but our our bizarre concepts that somehow children will be raised as imbeciles simply because we don't believe in the age of the earth is kind of ridiculous. I'm not even sure what the age of the earth matters to 99.999% of anything. I don't know. But people get so impassioned about this. I will hear, guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson say, "Oh my gosh, we're if we don't teach children this, we're teaching lies, and if we allow them to think this." For heaven's sakes, guys, we're not stupid. Kids aren't stupid. We get to a certain age, we have to figure these things out for ourselves. All of us do. So, have a little faith, for heaven's sakes. And I've had other problems with Neil deGrasse Tyson. He, has some negative things to say about philosophy. He kind of seems to be one of those ultimate priests in the religion of science who says anything that questions science is sort of bad. And I have the feeling even he is one of those people, much like conservative Christians, where if you had a good conversation with him and he wasn't on the television, he wasn't being questioned, he wasn't knowing that what he said went out to the masses, he might be very logical and understanding of the spiritual side of things. But he has this tendency to stick his fist up in the air and say, "No, this is true, and what you say isn't true." And obviously that's not the best way to come across to people. So do Christians think science is complete baloney? Of course they don't. I'm not going to get into global warming and climate change and that sort of thing. Not in this video. I'll get into them in another video. But I will say for the moment that every single one of us has a tendency to believe what we want to believe. And that might sound kind of obvious, but what that essentially says is if I want to feel a certain way, I'm going to find evidence for it. And I think that's certainly true when it comes to science. I think that, and Christianity and belief systems in general. And so I think to some extent we all have to recognize when we see someone with whatever belief system that we not merely see, okay, that's their belief system, but why is it their belief system? Why do they have a reason for feeling this way or the other? Or at this moment in this conversation, am I saying something that they're simply reacting to? Or am I getting a real understanding of what they actually believe? Because all of us shift in between. And simply stereotyping all scientists as being cold and calculating and uncaring and stereotyping Christians as being hicks sitting on tractors chewing corn that don't know anything about how the earth revolves around the sun are both absurdities. In the end, all of this is about us trying to understand each other. So, for whatever that's worth. I'm the urban omnist, and believe it or not, all of my Christian friends do believe in science. Christians hate science. They just hate it. It's like, hi, I'm Christianity. Hi, I'm science. Christians hate science. They always hated science. Ever since the days when Marco Polo said, hey, what if we could go to India that way? Christians hate science. I mean, they just hate it. It's like two sides of the same thing getting flipped out through the orbit of Pluto and then thrown on its back and pummeled like an ice cream sandwich thrown down by a 2-year-old in a frenzy who just jumps up and... Christians hate science. They just hate it. They hate it. I mean, many years ago, science, stood Christianity up on a date. And ever since then, Christianity has just been like, I hate you. I hate you, science. You have stood me up. And I want nothing more to do with you. But your sister's kind of cute.